That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
There's a photograph that Rod Serling kept on his desk until the day he died. It was not a publicity still from The Twilight Zone, nor was it a memento from his years in Hollywood. It was a picture of a burned village in the Pacific, taken sometime during World War II, a reminder of what human beings were capable of when fear and nationalism were allowed to do their worst. Serling rarely spoke about that photograph publicly, but those who knew him said it explained almost everything about the television he made, why he was incapable of telling a simple story, why every tale he put on screen carried a hidden weight, and why, above all, he was constitutionally unable to let an uncomfortable truth lie buried just because someone found it inconvenient. This is a story about one episode of The Twilight Zone that someone did find inconvenient. Deeply, almost dangerously inconvenient. It is also a story about what happens when a piece of art refuses to stay buried, when the very reasons it was hidden become, decades later, the reasons it demands to be seen. The episode is called The Encounter. It aired once, on May 1st, 1964, and then it vanished. Not lost, not misfiled, deliberately removed. Pulled from syndication packages, excluded from home video releases, omitted from cable marathon broadcasts that otherwise ran the entire series in rotation. For more than half a century, The Encounter existed as a rumor, a gap in the catalog, a ghost in the archive of American television history. Until now. Because the world has changed, and the questions that episode raised in 1964 have not gone away. If anything, they have grown more urgent, more raw, more impossible to ignore. And that is precisely why the return of The Encounter matters, not as a curiosity, not as a historical footnote, but as a reckoning with who we were, who we are, and what stories we still do not know how to tell. Rod Serling was not supposed to be a television writer. He was supposed to be dead. He had enlisted in the United States Army at 17, served as a paratrooper with the 511th Airborne Division in the Pacific Theater, and witnessed things on the islands of Leyte and Luzon that he would spend the rest of his life trying to process. He watched friends die in ways that made no dramatic sense, no narrative sense, randomly, absurdly, in the middle of sentences they would never finish. He came home from the war with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. He came home, also, with an overwhelming need to say something true. What he discovered quickly was that American television in the early 1950s had no interest in true things. The networks wanted product, clean, sponsor-friendly, conflict-resolving entertainment that did not disturb the digestion of the viewing audience or upset the advertising partners who were paying the bills. Serling, who had an almost physical revulsion toward dishonesty, clashed with this system almost immediately. He wrote plays that were rejected, revised until they were unrecognizable, stripped of their central argument, and left as hollow shells of what he had intended. He became known in the industry as a talent, but also as a problem, someone who insisted on meaning when meaning was bad for business. The defining wound came in 1956 when Serling wrote a teleplay called Noon on Doomsday, intended as a fictional response to the murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who was brutally killed in Mississippi the previous year after allegedly whistling at a white woman. His murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury after deliberating for just over an hour. The acquittal had shocked the country, or at least that part of the country that was paying attention. Serling wanted to put on television. What aired instead was a gutted version in which the victim had been changed to an anonymous foreigner, the southern setting relocated to somewhere vague and unidentifiable, and every specific cultural and racial detail scrubbed clean by network executives terrified of losing their southern affiliate stations and their sponsors. Serling was devastated, but he was also galvanized. He understood now what he was dealing with. The American television system was not going to let him say what he needed to say through straightforward drama. So he would have to find another way. And that other way was The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS on October 2, 1959, and its formula was deceptively simple. Each week, a self-contained story. No recurring characters, no serial plot, no obligation to the episode before or after it. Just a premise, a twist, and a moral, delivered by Serling himself in his calm, measured, slightly ominous narration from the top and bottom of each episode. The network thought it was buying a science fiction anthology. What it got was something considerably more dangerous, a vehicle for social criticism wrapped so thoroughly in genre conventions that the censors often did not realize what they were approving until it was already on air. Sorling was explicit about the strategy in interviews. If he wrote a drama about racism in the American South, it would never get past the sponsors. But if he wrote a story about an alien planet where one group of beings was persecuted for the color of their antennae, well, that was just science fiction. Nothing to worry about. Sponsors could relax. And American audiences could watch the episode and feel the sting of it without the network ever having to formally acknowledge what they were actually watching. It was a kind of creative judo, using the weight of the industry's own cowardice to flip it on its back. Over 5 seasons and 156 episodes, The Twilight Zone became one of the most morally ambitious programs in the history of American television. It tackled nuclear anxiety, McCarthyism, the psychology of conformity, the horror of mob justice, the loneliness of old age, the arrogance of technological progress, and dozens of other subjects that straight drama was still too nervous to approach directly. Episodes like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, in which suburban neighbors turn on each other under the suggestion of alien invasion, were so clearly about Red Scare paranoia that it seems almost impossible now that they aired without controversy. But the genre framing provided just enough distance. People could watch and think, this is a story about aliens. And then, driving home, the real meaning would settle in like a cold fog. But the Twilight Zone's method was not foolproof. The further Sorling pushed, the more he tested the invisible boundaries of what the system would tolerate. Ratings were never spectacular enough to give the show total immunity. Sponsors remained skittish. CBS executives grew increasingly uncomfortable with Sorling's political instincts and the complaints that The Encounter was written by Martin M. Goldsmith, a screenwriter with a long Hollywood resume who had never worked on The Twilight Zone before. It is a bottle episode, television jargon for a production set entirely in single location with a minimal cast, usually produced to save money. The location is an attic. The cast is 2 men. And for 25 minutes, those 2 men do nothing but talk, remember, and slowly unmask each other in a confrontation that grows more explosive with every passing scene. The first man is Fenton, played by Neville Brand, a veteran character actor who had himself served in World War II and earned the Distinguished Service Cross, making him, at the time, one of the most decorated actors in Hollywood. Fenton is a middle-aged veteran, sorting through decades of accumulated junk in his attic when the second man appears. His name is Arthur Takamori, played by a young, pre-fame George Takei, and he has come looking for yard work. What begins as a casual interaction, a beer offered, a task assigned, and easy surface-level friendliness between 2 strangers, begins almost immediately to curdle. Fenton finds a Japanese samurai sword among his things, a trophy he brought back from the Pacific, and the discovery opens something in him. He starts talking about the war, about what he saw, about what he did. The conversation gradually, inexorably shifts into territory that neither man seems fully in control of, as if the attic itself is pulling the words out of them. Then Arthur says something that stops the episode dead in its tracks. He reveals that his real name is Taro, and that his father was a spy for Imperial Japan who helped pass intelligence that contributed to the attack on Pearl Harbor. This confession arrives like a grenade. In an instant, the entire atmosphere of the episode transforms. Fenton's wartime trauma fuses with racial suspicion. Arthur's own psychological torment, the burden of an identity shaped by internment, by inherited shame, by growing up marked as the enemy in the country of his birth, twists into something destructive. The sword, which Arthur handles with increasing intensity, begins to feel less like an artifact and more like a force. He says it has a spirit, that it wants blood. The 2 men circle each other in that attic like animals in a trap neither of them set, but neither can escape. The episode ends in violence. It is not gratuitous. This is still 1964 network television, but it is unflinching. And more than the violence, it is the ambiguity that stays with you. Was Arthur telling the truth about his father? Is the sword supernatural, or is it a symbol of the violence men carry inside them that needs no supernatural explanation? Is Fenton a victim of trauma, or a perpetrator of something he refuses to name? Sorling's narration at the close does not explain. It does not resolve. It simply notes that the encounter has ended, leaving the audience to sit with the full, uncomfortable weight of what they have just witnessed. CBS received complaints almost immediately after the encounter aired on May 1, 1964. The nature of the complaints was varied and, in some ways, contradictory. Some viewers found the episode racist, specifically the portrayal of Arthur's father as a spy, which seemed to validate the very logic that had been used to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. Others found it anti-American, or too morally ambiguous, or simply too intense for primetime television. Some objected to the ending. Some objected to the entire premise. What united all these complaints was discomfort. The Encounter did not allow its audience a safe position. It did not offer a hero to root for or a villain to hate. Both men were simultaneously sympathetic and culpable, both trapped by history in ways they cannot fully articulate, both acting out a drama whose script had been written long before either of them entered the attic. That kind of moral complexity was not what American television audiences in 1964 had been trained to expect or desire. The system had been built on clarity. The Twilight Zone, at its most dangerous, offered only fog. To understand how incendiary the episode's central plot point was is necessary to understand what 1964 America actually knew, and did not want to know, about Japanese American internment. The executive order that authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from their homes on the West Coast had been signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in February 1942, just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Over the months that followed, more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, approximately two-thirds of them American citizens by birth, were forced to leave their homes, businesses, farms, and communities and relocate to one of 10 internment camps scattered across remote, inhospitable regions of the American interior. These people were not charged with crimes. They were not given hearings. The government's own intelligence assessments at the time, classified and not shared with the public, concluded that the vast majority of Japanese Americans posed no security threat whatsoever. The internment was driven by racial hysteria, political calculation, and the economic interests of those who stood to benefit from Japanese American land and business losses. It was one of the most significant violations of civil liberties in the history of the United States. And in 1964, it had barely begun to be acknowledged as such. The formal government apology would not come for another 24 years. The full historical reckoning has arguably not arrived yet. Into this landscape of denial and suppression, The Encounter dropped a story in which a Japanese-American character confesses, or seems to confess, that his father was complicit in the Pearl Harbor attack. The implication, however ambiguous, however complicated by the episode's refusal to confirm whether the confession is literally true, was more than CBS was prepared to defend. Rather than stand behind the episode or engage with the complaints it generated, the network made the quieter, safer choice. The Encounter was removed from a syndication package. When the Twilight Zone entered reruns, it simply was not there. What almost no one in the television audience understood in 1964 was the biographical dimension of what they were watching. George Takei, the young actor playing Arthur Takamori, had not simply researched the experience of Japanese-American internment for the role. He had lived it. Takei was born in Los Angeles in 1937. He was 4 years old when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. He was 5 when soldiers came to his family's home in the Boyle Heights neighborhood and informed his parents that they had days to evacuate and report to an assembly center.